Well, Kemi Badenoch, the Conservative leader, is here. Welcome. It's great to have you with us on such an important day. The Prime Minister described putting together what he said would be a coalition of the willing. And we don't have all the details, but what we understand is that there would be some UK troops, some French troops available to guard and to maintain a peace in Ukraine after a deal had been done. Is that something the Conservatives would support?
Well, I think we need to know, as you say, exactly what that means. Last week, I did ask him, when he talked about putting British troops on the ground, where was the money coming from? What were the guarantees around that? We certainly shouldn't be doing it on our own. And, looking at the scenes from last week, it's really important that this summit that the Prime Minister is having today goes well. We support him in that. This is a key issue of national interest for us. There is not a difference between the Conservative and Labour parties in terms of the extent of support that we have for Ukraine. People know what we did under Prime Minister Johnson and his successors. And we want to make sure that the Prime Minister is successful in helping Ukraine, but also in maintaining our national interest at all times.
What did you think when you saw those scenes in the Oval Office on Friday night with President Trump berating President Zelensky?
Honestly, my heart went out to President Zelensky. I watched it and I couldn't believe what was happening. He was being humiliated. I don't think we should conduct these sorts of difficult conversations in front of the cameras. And we have to remember that President Zelensky is a hero. He is the person who represents that strength and resilience of the Ukrainian people. And whatever differences and difficulties we might have during negotiations, we need to be able to set them aside when everyone's watching, because the only person who would have liked that would have been Vladimir Putin.
Do you think it was an ambush? I mean, there have been suggestions it was some kind of deliberate setup to make President Zelensky be humiliated.
No, I don't think it was an ambush. I think that both parties are working for their respective national interest, and they seem to be speaking at cross purposes. I think sometimes having English as a second language is not necessarily helpful. During all the trade negotiations I had as trade secretary, most of the Eastern European countries had an interpreter there. I'm not necessarily sure that we should be doing more than the set piece bits on camera. I don't think that was helpful. But we need to make sure that we can get the conversations back on track. It is critical that Ukraine is at the table for any negotiation. We should be negotiating a peace settlement, not a surrender. We need to make sure that President Zelensky feels that he has autonomy. They are a sovereign country, and the principles that we're defending are the freedom of Ukraine and sovereignty.
Given what happened on Friday, though, do you stand by saying Donald Trump is a force for good in the world?
America is a force for good in the world. Donald Trump is the president. I think that he is, yes. So I'm not changing that. And I think we need to be very careful. Lots of people have personal views about Donald Trump, but whether or not you like the president or the vice president is separate from our relationship as the UK with the US. That is something that is absolutely vital. If people are worried about what we're spending on defense now, if we don't have an American security guarantee within NATO, if we lose them, we're going to be spending a hell of a lot more. We need to make sure that America does not disengage. It is in their interest for peace now. If we all get dragged into an escalation, America will get dragged into it eventually. That's bad for all of us.
Do you, though, believe that President Trump knows who the villain is? And I ask you that question because you wrote on social media, we need to remember who the villain is. But we all heard Donald Trump say, I don't want to give Ukraine an advantage. I'm for Russia and I'm from Ukraine. I'm kind of in the middle. Do you think he knows who the villain is, to use your word?
Well, the US, has a long history with Russia, but we have more recent issues. You'll remember the Salisbury poisoning, for example. So we are on the continent. We know what is at stake. And I think sometimes in the heat of the moment, things can be forgotten. And when we say that we need to remember who the villain is Vladimir Putin invaded a sovereign country. He could end this war today by withdrawing, and we must not forget that.
But do you think? But my question is really: do you think President Trump sometimes forgets that?
I think President Trump is practicing his own kind of diplomacy. I understand. It was a point that Piers made very well, that he needs to get both sides to the table. And so just criticizing willy-nilly is not necessarily helpful.
I think that's what's happened. It's about whether or not the American president, who, as you say, is trying to bring this thing together, but about whether he sees the two countries as equivalent, or whether he sees one country as the country that must be protected and the other as the country that ought to stop, that should never have started this in the first place,
Well,
which is how every other Western country sees it.
I cannot speak for President Trump. I can only speak for the UK and how we see things. And I've been very clear. Vladimir Putin is the villain.
You agree with the government that defence spending must go up, but you've written today it must hit 3% of national income by the end of this by the end of the decade, and that would be a huge increase. Absolutely. Even though the percentages sound like they're quite small, but that would be a very significant increase. Where would you be willing to cut from public services that people already enjoy, or things that people rely on, or potentially raise tax in order to get that extra money? I suspect you're not going to go for the raising tax.
So this is a fundamental question. When I was in cabinet, we talked about getting to 3% by 2030, and we couldn't make the numbers work. We need to find a way to make the numbers work because the world is changing very quickly. And with things like defence, you can't make a decision at the last minute. It takes years, well beyond Parliament, to actually get the equipment produced. People will not start making the equipment unless they know we're going to spend the money. We're not ordering dresses here. We're ordering tanks, missiles, new technology that is not even on the books yet.
So where do you get the money from?
So that requires fundamentally economic growth. And the problem we have now is that what Labour is doing is reducing growth, not increasing it.
But where would you get the money from?
I am speaking now about what the economy needs. I am not in the government. We will help them to get there. But what I'm not going to do is make spending plans when we don't have access to the books anymore. We've talked about making savings on development. I'm very pleased that the Prime Minister now agrees with me. I remember when he was in Jeremy Corbyn's cabinet and they were talking about disbanding NATO.
If you want to get to 3%, you'd have to be willing to look at other options.
Yes, of course we have to.
And you said you'd support the government.
Yes, of course we have to. But what I'm not going to do is make policy on the fly. This sort of thing requires real thinking. Let's start looking at what we can do. It's not about making an announcement on breakfast TV. It's about us setting up task forces, looking at the economy. What can we do?
But your shadow defence secretary told us
statement?
Last week that you should look at welfare in order to make savings.
Yes, and I said that in my letter to Keir Starmer as well. But that's not going to deliver what could be up to 100 billion. We have to look seriously at our whole economy, how it is wired, how we do procurement. We should be looking perhaps at 10-year budgets for defence, so that we're not just looking at what's going to happen till the next election, but much longer term. That's something that I'm willing to work with the Prime Minister on.
Are you going to give up your opposition to the Chagos deal? Now, President Trump has appeared to back it. He said on Thursday, I think we'll be inclined to go along with your country. I have a feeling it's going to work out very well. So if the American president has given it a green light, is there any point you carrying on resisting it?
I don't work for the American president. This is about UK national interest. It is not in our national interest to give away the Chagos Islands and pay for the privilege of doing so. That is taxpayers' money. That is money which the Prime Minister seems to have confirmed is coming out of the defence increase that he has just announced. That's terrible. He did not deny it when he was asked. So we will not stop our opposition to the surrender of the Chagos Islands. We will continue.
We asked Keir Starmer this question too, and I think people would be interested to know. We know from viewers getting in touch with us and general public reaction, a lot of people feel quite alarmed by what's happened in the last few weeks. Lots of people in this country feel a real affinity for Ukraine. Lots of people have taken Ukrainians into their homes in this country. And do you think people are wrong to feel scared at the moment when they see all this turmoil and questions being asked about our long-term security?
I don't think people should feel scared, but I do think we need to stop being complacent and assume that things will always be fine and we don't need to change anything. The way to make sure that we can provide reassurance is by focusing on security, thinking ahead, and not waiting until things happen and then being reactive. Of course, we have a lot of affinity with Ukraine, especially since the war. Most of us in the country know so much more about Ukraine now than we did in 5 years ago. But we have to make sure that we are staying resilient so we can continue to support them. We have to be strong so that we can help Ukraine.
Kemi Badenoch, thanks so much for coming in this morning on such an important day. It's great to have you with us. Thank you very much indeed. Well, of course, the relationship between our two countries has been very strong.